Well, good morning, all. We're glad that you're here. I mentioned to somebody previously that I was trainable, and evidently the bell rings and I pop up. So I'm trainable in that regard. Glad you all are here. Mike Green and his family are out of town on a quick vacation, and so I'm stepping in. So if you were looking forward to Mike presenting, please come back next week and he'll do that. This week, I'm sorry you're stuck with me. Carla and I were working on Bible lessons. Carla's teaching the 2, 3, and 4-year-olds. So she's working on crafts and videos and snacks and all that. She said, well, what are you taking to class? I said, me. And then, so I'm sorry, there are no snacks, no crafts, and no videos. Our AV folks are delighted that there are no videos. It's just one more level of challenge there, but nonetheless, glad that you're with us today. We're going to talk about the early church and church growth and church governance as we're together this morning. I want to ask, has anybody been around a situation where, maybe it was a small company that started just a few people maybe in a house or maybe in a small workshop, and it grew into a huge organization? Anybody ever observed that? Maybe, yes, being involved with that. That's a and I think that's one of the things that we will look at today in our study is the challenge of growth and organization. I think about some of the small companies that started out as maybe just 2 or 3 people, and they suddenly became multi-million-dollar businesses, sold themselves to other conglomerates, and became larger. But we think about the early church in the 70 years that followed the death of Jesus into basically AD 100. And we see an explosive growth, and with that came opportunities, and it also came some challenges. And so we'll take a look at those things. This may be a little hard for some of you to see, but this is a quick map and a quick look at Jerusalem down here in the bottom right-hand corner as I look at the slide, and then the growth that happened from there. We see churches going all across what was then known as the world. And so the Bible was very true in the fact that the church began in Judea, and then it went to Samaria and to the ends of the world. We'll take a look in a few moments at a city up here on the far right side, Antioch. That's Antioch in Syria. And so we'll talk about Antioch in a few moments. That was where West met East, and so we'll talk through that. But in Acts chapter 8, verse 4, it tells us that the Christians were scattered, and they went everywhere preaching the word. And so in the first 70 years of the church, there was just an explosive growth as people left Jerusalem by choice or not by choice, and then went into all the world and began to establish churches in many, many places. We think about how many churches that maybe we have founded in the last 70 years, or how many churches that have been established in just the last 50 years, here in America or around the world. And I think about the missions that we support, and just a shameless plug, if you're interested in supporting some of the mission work that we do at Champions, Wes Smith is heading up our missions organization or our missions ministry. And so think about where we support people. Domestically, we have Dale DuVernay in northern Michigan. And believe me, northern Michigan is a mission location, much like the Pacific Northwest. But in northern Michigan, there are probably about, in all of Michigan, there are about 20 churches of Christ. Northern Michigan, there's about 5. And Dale is involved with 3 of them. So a lot of opportunities there. We think about Will Hanstein, and we've supported Will in several of his endeavors. Currently, he's in Knoxville, Tennessee, and working with the Southeast Institute of Biblical Studies. And so there's an opportunity there domestically. We think about some of our international and foreign missions. The Biblical Institute of Central America, which is preparing men and women to be preachers, women to be leaders in the churches in Guatemala and Honduras. We know that Roland and Rose Motion are in Paris, France, doing a great work there. The World Bible School, many of you are involved in that. Anybody have a student in World Bible School right now? There's a great opportunity. The thing is with World Bible School is that you don't physically have to be anywhere. You can do that by correspondence. And it's a beautiful opportunity. Roman and Joanna Halamisic are in Bratislava, Slovakia, and they're doing a good work there. We support Peter Chin at the Four Seasons Bible College in Singapore, and he's training men to be preachers throughout that whole Far East region. We support a church in Taipei, Taiwan, and I know that we've had some that have made the trip over there and done work with that church. I know that Alan has another plan to take a group this next year and support that. Eastern European missions, we've been involved in supporting that for a long time. Truth for Today, the World Mission School. So we think of Truth for Today as being the concordances or the commentaries that we receive, but there's a plethora of information that they send out to ministers and churches all around the world, giving them Bible studies, Bible classes, those types of things. And then we support the Hope for Haiti's children. So if you're interested in mission work, you can be involved here and do much of what was happening in the first century, growing the church as we move forward. Have you ever expected something to happen right now, but based on your expectation and your knowledge, but the reality was it was going to happen in the future? Anybody been like that? Absolutely. I won't speak for any of you, but I had, as a child, high expectations at Christmas time, right? Hey, I'm going to get this and such or that and such. And Christmas came and went, and I didn't. But, hey, Jay, if you keep earning money, you can buy it for yourself kind of thing, right? And so, we think about those types of things. When we think about church growth, we think about the fact that the church, the early church, they didn't have a lot of governance because they were expecting Christ to come right back. He had died, he'd been buried, he was raised from the dead, and they had an expectation that he would be coming back to the earth in a pretty short order. And that wasn't actually the case. We see that when we look at Paul's 2 Thessalonian letter, there's maybe something that could be interpreted as an immediate promise, right? In chapter 1, verse 6, since indeed God considers it just to repay with affliction those who afflict you, and to grant relief to you who are afflicted as well as us, when the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven with his mighty angels. So we think about the church in Thessalonica, they were oppressed. And they were in a situation, they were looking for relief. They were looking for some deliverance. And some of these words might lead them to believe that Christ was coming back right then and going to take care of them. But that wasn't exactly the plan. We also see that in Hebrews 9:28. So Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly awaiting for him. So we had Christians that were eagerly waiting for Christ to come again. And so as they read these words, as they hear these words, they're thinking this is going to happen pretty soon. And that wasn't actually the case. But they were expecting great relief in short order. When we think about how the church came together, we think about some organization. Here's a completely no-trick question. The answer is Jesus. Who's the head of the church? Absolutely. Thank you. Man, you guys are great. Just warming you up for Brian, right? So Jesus is the head of the church. And then there was an organizational need to have elders and deacons to support the local churches. So when we think about elders, we hear many words for elders. We hear presbyters, we hear shepherds, we hear overseers. Those types of words are used. Here at the church in Champions, we have 7 men that serve as elders. Besides myself is Troy Thompson, Drew Slatton, Bill Johnson, Don Sammons, Alan Reed, and Wes Smith. And I will tell you, these men have hearts for God, and they have hearts for you. And they are very, very concerned with your souls and being sure that the church in Champions reflects God's church. And so we think about the elders and the different skills that they would bring to a church. In Romans 12, we read about the gifts. Romans 12, verse 6, having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, let us use them. If it's prophecy, if it's service, if it's teaching, if it's exhortation, if it's contribution, or if it's leadership or acts of mercy. Those are just a few of the things that are listed as opportunities for service. But those are gifts that we have and gifts that we can use within the church. There are a lot of verses that talk about elders and the church and how they relate to one another. 1 Thessalonians 5:12, respect those who labor among you and are over you in the Lord. The idea of our elders being over the church in the local assembly. Hebrews 13:7, remember your leaders and imitate their faith. Hebrews 13:17, for they are keeping watch over your souls as those who have to give an account. As an elder, that's a very scary scripture. All right, we're charged with ensuring your souls are pure and safe for the resurrection, and that is something that we have to give an account for to God. Hebrews 13:24, greet all your leaders and all the saints. Acts 20:28, the Holy Spirit has made you overseers to care for the church of God, which he obtained with his own blood. And then Acts 14:23, and when they had appointed elders for them in every church with prayer and fasting, they committed them to the Lord. And so the idea of elders is that there is a huge responsibility in that role. And the men that serve as elders here at Champions, I encourage you to pray for them daily and to know that they are doing the best that they can to support the church here and care for your souls. We also think about some of the qualifications for elders. And we see in 1 Timothy chapter 3 qualifications for not only elders but also deacons that we'll talk about in a moment. And then also Titus chapter 1, we see the qualifications for elders. And so when we read those sections of Scripture, we really think about, well, that's for an elder or that's for a deacon. I would say that, yes, those are qualifications for a role, but I would say they're also a characteristic that we should all have as Christians, that we should be doing taking care of one another, that we should be concerned about our brother and sister, that we should be leading in a way that is appropriate and godly. And so, as we think about the church here at Champions, we're always in a place where we're looking for leaders. And so, men, as you're looking at yourselves and looking at your life, I'd like you to consider the fact that service is an area where you can play an important part here in the church. We think about the ministers in the first century. Who were some of the ministers that come to mind really quickly when we think about people that spread the word of God? Peter? Who else? Paul? Stephen? Timothy? Absolutely. Were they confined to one place? No, not at all. They would be what we would call an itinerant minister. All right, somebody that traveled around and preached the word. Not an irate minister, an itinerant minister. Okay, I just want to be sure you got that straight. And that wasn't uncommon, right? How many of you may have grown up in an area of the country where you had preachers that would come kind of make a circuit? Anybody have that? Maybe one or two. I know that, yes, all right, thank you. So we had ministers that came and they ministered in an area. They weren't necessarily associated with one individual congregation. We are blessed here at Champions to have Brian and to have Irvin and to have Wes as our ministers. There is a blessing in having ministers that are specific to our congregation. They know each of us, they serve each of us, they exhort us, they preach the word. So many good things that come from having ministers that are associated with a location, and we are blessed because of that. In some of the congregations, elders appointed deacons, or literally servants, to distribute food and other items. We see that in 1 Timothy 3, which is the qualifications for a deacon. We know that in Acts chapter 6, there was a bit of a challenge that arose. What happened in Acts chapter 6? Anyone? Distribution of food to the widows. Now, I don't know about you, but if I miss a meal, I may get hangry. Anybody been hangry before? All right. So there was a need here that the Hellenistic widows were being overlooked in the distribution of food. And I think that's a very important thing for us to consider. There was a complaint by the Hellenists that rose up against the Hebrews. And the elders summoned the full number of the disciples together and said, it's not right that we should stop doing what we're doing as elders, which was preaching. And then we need people that will serve tables. Therefore, brothers, verse 3 of Acts 6, pick out from among you 7 men of good repute, full of the Spirit and of wisdom, and we will appoint them to this duty. So here's an example where there was a specific need. The deacons were assigned to take care of that. We'll talk more about who they were in a few moments. But there was a need that they did so that it didn't take away the focus, if you will, of the apostles and the elders of the church. I think it's important as we think about that. We have about 21 deacons that serve here at Champions, each of them in a specific area, some of them in multiple areas. Most of our ministries have at least 2, if not 3 deacons working in them so that the work of the church can continue and be done in a way that is orderly, and it's done in a way that is supportive of our congregation and certainly uplifting to God. And so we think about those roles, elders and deacons, but then we think about the church members. You know, what are the roles of church members? I think we've all got a role. And, inwardly we take care of those that are in need, our community. I'll tell you what, if there's somebody that's coming out of the hospital, they better be sure before they went to the hospital they cleaned out their refrigerator and their freezer, because food's coming, all right? You guys do a great job of providing food for those that need it during times of need, whether that's from a medical procedure or maybe a loss of a loved one. We gather together to worship. We come together and encourage one another. We take time to have communion together. And this slide says a communion meal. We also come together to eat. And so, that's a good thing, right? Fellowship is part of that relationship that we have. And we share the word with others. With one another, we sharpen each other. And then we are prepared to go out and evangelize. And so those are actions and activities that we think about that the church, the members, certainly do within the local church. And then we think about, in Acts, the first community that we see. The first believers were Jewish. And we know that because in Acts chapter 2, Peter, standing with the 11, lifted up his voice and addressed them, men of Judea and all who dwell in Jerusalem. And so we know that primarily that was a Jewish audience that he was speaking to. And then we think about the fact that they were loyal to the Jewish law. We know that Jesus' mother Mary was together with them. In Acts chapter 1, verse 14, we learn about the apostles. It says, all these with one accord were devoting themselves to prayer, together with the women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and his brothers. Now, I don't know about you, there's two things about this scripture. One, it tells me about the closeness that they have. And I read that, for years about this closeness that existed between the apostles and the ladies there and Mary and Jesus' brothers, and that was wonderful. And then I'm standing in the foyer one day, and Nolan Saunier comes up to me and he said, Jay, what kind of car did the apostles have? It's like, they had no car. Yes, they did. They had one accord. And so the Bible tells me all these with one accord. So they had one car to share between the 12 of them, and I can never read that verse differently again, right? I always stop there and think of Brother Nolan. So we think about those things, the fact that they were gathered together. They were the church. They were the ecclesia. And they were an assembly that had come together. We also know that the church had a couple of special ceremonies that were observed. We know baptism, and we also know the Lord's Supper. And so when we think about names for the church, we think about the Church of Christ. Back in that time, the church was also known as what? The way, absolutely. We think about John chapter 14, verse 6. Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So the way is a good name. The truth, the life, those types of things. How many of you have been down roads and seen signs and you're coming into a little town? There's typically a white sign on the side of the road, black lettering, Church of Christ welcomes you. Church of Christ meets at this corner, that kind of thing? Absolutely. That's something that we here in the South see an awful lot. Other parts of the country, we don't see that. That is just not something that is common. But we see that a lot in what we call the Bible Belt. And so there's a welcoming there from the churches of Christ. And I don't know about you, but I kind of find some comfort in that, right? There's the Church of Christ at First and Adams, or whatever the cross street is. And so we think about the Jerusalem community. We think about the church in Jerusalem. They were a close-knit group of people that were expecting Christ to return soon. They were also sharing everything that they had. I think about, why in the world would they expect that Christ was going to return soon? Well, in Acts chapter 15 and verse 16, Amos 9:11 is quoted. And it says, after this, I will return, and I will rebuild the tent of David that has fallen. I will rebuild its ruins, and I will restore it. So this is Amos, who was an Old Testament prophet, but he was prophesying about the fact that Jesus would return and rebuild, basically make a new Jerusalem. Now we know the new Jerusalem is heaven, but at this point, many people were thinking Jesus is going to come back. Anybody keep checklists for the things that they do? Man, I love checklists if I can get a check on there. If I can't get a check, I don't like it so much. But you think about Amos 9:11. After this, I will return. Okay, check. And I'm going to rebuild the tent of David that has fallen. Well, I can't put a check there yet, but I'm getting ready to. And then I'm going to rebuild its ruins. This is Jesus. Well, he hadn't done that yet, but I'm ready to check the box. So they were ready for Jesus to return. We think about Acts in kind of the first 6 chapters of Acts. Acts chapter 2, the church was established, and we know that well. Acts chapter 4, they had everything in common, and they were sharing what they had. In Acts chapter 5, signs and wonders were being performed and sick people were being healed. In Acts chapter 6, as we just talked about, deacons were being installed to ensure that the Hellenistic Jews were provided for in the distribution of food. And so we know that this organization is existing. So then it comes up, well, when should we meet? When should we get together? And so we think about, why do we worship on Sunday? And we think about that from the context of, that's different than the Jewish custom of Sabbath. And so now we're meeting together on the first day. And so in John 20, verse 1, we see that now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was yet dark and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. And then in John 20:26, Jesus appears as one of the post-resurrection appearances. 8 days later, so the following Sunday, his disciples were inside again, and Thomas was with them. And although the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." So here we have some examples of that first day. We think about the examples of the first century Christians worshiping on the first day. In Acts 20, verse 7, on the first day of the week, we came together to break bread. And then also in 1 Corinthians 16:2, on the first day of every week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with your income, so that when I come, no collection will have to be made. And it was a request for money to take back to the Jews that were being the Christians that were being persecuted in Jerusalem. And so there's a lot of reasons that we look to, and this change of, worshiping under the old law, the Sabbath, and the new law, the first day of the week. And there's a blessing in doing that, and that's why we're here together today. It's a wonderful opportunity for us to come together and worship. I think about Acts chapter 4 and some of the things that were going on. And we think about some of the prayers for boldness. We know Peter and John were in prison, and so they were praying for boldness. Now, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but anybody ever been in prison? No. I had the opportunity to be behind bars, and this is a really scary thing, right? It's one of those things where, as a company, you find somebody. It's a fundraiser for. In my case, it was for leukemia, so it was lock up your boss. So, and you're looking for folks that are going to give money to bail you out, right? Well, man, if you really want to find out how well your employees like you, have them lock you in a jail cell and wait for them to bail you out. So, nonetheless, I'm in there and I'm sitting there, and it's a fun experience and it's nice and all that. But I'm sitting on this little metal bench, and people are coming by and heckling and doing all the things they're going to do, and I'm not really. I'm thinking, if I was really in here for a real reason, I'm not sure I'd be praying for boldness, right? I'd be praying for deliverance. I'd be praying for, somebody to bail me out. I'd be praying for a lot of things. Please don't send anybody else here in the jail cell with me. All these things, right? But I don't think I'd be praying for boldness. And we see in Acts chapter 4, Peter and John are in prison, and they're rejoicing, and they're praying for that boldness. And what a blessing that is. Also in Acts chapter 4, we see that the church members had everything in common. They were sharing as they were blessed, sharing as they had need, and someone had abundance. They were sharing that. And I see that also in our church family here as well. And then we think about some of the special generosity that was called out. Here we have Barnabas, who sold a field, and I didn't realize, but Mike had done some background. It could have been a large field, or it could have been just a burial plot. Doesn't really matter what it was. The issue is he had property, and he sold that property, and he brought those proceeds to the church and laid those funds at the feet of the apostles. And so we see generosity. So we see prayers for boldness, we see sharing with one another, and we see generosity coming about. All of those things are happening, but then, as is common with people, there's the old statement, what's mine is mine and what's yours is mine. And so this kind of positions us for one of the first opportunities in the church for discipline to be exhibited. We see in Acts chapter 5 the story of Ananias and Sapphira, who sold a field, sold property that they had, and they wanted to bring the proceeds to the apostles. In chapter 5, verse 1, but a man named Ananias with his wife Sapphira sold a piece of property, and with his wife's knowledge, he kept back for himself some of the proceeds and brought only a part of it and laid it at the apostles' feet. And so this begins a whole dialogue between Peter and Ananias, and Peter and Sapphira, and the church that was there, about the fact that what I perceive is Ananias said, I sold this for $100, but I'm only giving 80, and so I bring my 80 to you because that's what I had sold it for, as an example. So it was this idea about some self-righteousness. It's still mine. What's mine is mine. It's still mine. I'm going to take my cut, and I'll give what's left over. And so there was a sin here against the Holy Spirit. Continuing in Acts chapter 5, verse 5, a great fear came over upon all who heard it. And what they'd heard was Ananias immediately died. And then we think about Sapphira came in and had the same story. So, I know when I was little and I had my sister, so it was just my sister and me. And if we were trying to, protect each other, we'd get our stories straight, right? Okay, you tell mom and dad this, I'll tell mom and dad the same thing, that kind of stuff. Because we certainly didn't want to get in trouble any more than we did. And so it was one of those situations where they practiced their story, right? They brought their story. So Ananias first was in and had his story, and then here comes Sapphira, and she says the same story. And so then she also fell down dead. And in verse 11, a great fear came upon the whole church and upon all who heard of these things. But then we continue and we think about the fact that the Lord continued to grow the church. So this is an example of some discipline that happened in the early church, but it didn't stop the growth of the church. It just further impacted the honesty and the need that there was for the church. But along with that, there were different groups within the church family. There are different groups within our family. You look around the room, and we may have different skin color. We may have different education levels. We may have different income levels. We have all kinds of differences. You're a Ford guy, I'm a Chevy guy. Whatever it happens to be. So we have differences that exist. And so there were differences also in this first church. The Hellenists were a group of people that were in the church, and they were Greek-speaking Jewish Christians and also non-Christians. And so we have Hellenists and Jews coming together. And there were some things that each of those groups looked at each other and said, you're different. You're not like me. And I'm not sure exactly how to handle that. So when we think about the book of Acts, Hellenists refer to Jewish people who had adopted the Greek language and culture, as opposed to the Hebrews who spoke Aramaic or Hebrew and maintained some of the stricter Jewish traditions. And so there is that difference. You don't think like I think, or you think different, and there's some challenges there. We think about the fact that there were some deep traditions in the Greek culture that existed. Instead of monotheism, it was polytheism. So there's an idea there of multiple gods. We saw with Stephen coming in as a deacon, there was a need for those deacons to address the needs of the church. We think about the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And that was actually written over several centuries, but primarily the 3rd, 2nd, and 1st century BC. So the Septuagint was created because Greek was becoming the common language among the Jewish people, especially those outside of Judea. And we saw our map of the spread of the churches, and primarily that was outside of Judea. So that made the Hebrew Scriptures difficult to understand. And so the Septuagint was a critical text for both the Jewish communities and later for the early Christians. We talked about the need between the Hellenists and the Jewish widows, the needs there. In Acts chapter 6, verse 5, we see that there were 7 men that were selected as deacons to serve the needs of the Hellenistic widows. We see Stephen, Philip, Prochorus, Nicanor, Timon, Parmenius, and Nicholas. And so these 7 men were charged with being sure that the needs of the Hellenistic widows were taken care of, just as the needs of the Jewish widows were being taken care of. When we think about all of the things that were happening at that time, there was a push for the Jews to leave Jerusalem. They were being pushed out because of political issues, because of economic issues, those types of things. And so along with the Jews being pushed out were the Hellenistic Christians. And so they were being driven out from Jerusalem. And as they were, elders of the Jerusalem church sent out delegates to establish some of the relationships with those groups. And we think about Antioch, and if you reflect on the map earlier, we're talking about Antioch in Syria, over on that far right side. That's where the Eastern cultures met the Western cultures. That was a kind of the gateway, if you will, to the Roman Empire. Antioch was a major hub for trade, the trade coming from the east to the west. It was a meeting point of both Eastern and Western cultures. It was a melting pot of Greeks, Romans, Jews, and it was the political capital of the Roman province of Syria. And so Antioch was a very important place. And we see in Acts chapter 11, Barnabas, who went to Tarsus to look for Saul, and when he had found him, he brought him to Antioch. And for a whole year they met with the church and taught a great many people. And in Antioch the disciples were first called Christians. And so there was this area that was greatly impacted by the Christians leaving Jerusalem and going into these other parts of the world. I think about Antioch like I think about Houston. It's a melting pot, multicultural, great opportunities to experience a lot of different cultures within the confines of, the however many million people that we have here in Houston. So Antioch was very much similar to that. Stephen, we know, is one of those disciples, one of those deacons that served the Hellenistic widows, but he was also a spokesman. He was a preacher. He was telling the truth, spreading the truth, and spreading the gospel. We see in Acts chapter 6, Stephen is doing some great things, and it upset some of the people. And they brought Stephen to the council, the Jewish council, and charged him with insurrection. In Acts chapter 7, Stephen speaks his defense, and the result of his defense was he was stoned by the people. Acts chapter 8, verse 1, Saul approved of this execution. And from that arose a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem. And they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except for the apostles. The apostles stayed behind. And so we see that in Acts chapter 11, because of that persecution, there were Christians that moved to Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch, speaking the word and sharing it to those that were both Jews and Gentiles. And in verse 21 of Acts 11, and the hand of the Lord was with them, and a great number who believed turned to the Lord. And so we think about the impact that one situation with Stephen had on the growth of the church. Yes, ma'am.
How come they just chose Stephen? Did the other people not do as much as he did? Why was it just Stephen?
Okay, so he's not the only person that was persecuted and killed for the faith, but he was the one that was called out specifically here. I think it's part of the example of Stephen was a good example of servant for Christ in the church. He was also a preacher of the word, and he was the catalyst for the fact that after he was stoned, then all of the people that liked the Christians and welcomed them turned on the church, and that he was the catalyst for that growth outside of Jerusalem. So thank you for that. He's not the only one that we know of that was stoned or put in jail. Drew?
I think some of us don't realize, don't really talk about it much, but that was illegal.
Good point.
You know, they took Jesus before Pilate because they weren't allowed to put anyone to death.
Right.
And yet they got so enraged with Stephen that they did it anyway and made sure that they covered it up so that the Romans didn't know about it.
Yes.
And then the persecution of the Christians was all done clandestinely.
Okay.
So that again, because they're breaking the law, any Christian that they decided to put to death, and I thought most of them they threw in prison, but some of them they killed. And they
Okay.
were breaking the law by doing that.
All right.
And so that's just something to sort of note that they're, you know, just a sneaky thing.
Yes. Yes. Okay. So Drew has shared with us the fact that when they were killing Stephen, that was against the law. The Jewish council did not have the power to kill people, and so that was kind of something that they were doing without the blessing of the Roman government. And so they were looking at that and saying, well, you know, we need to take care of this ourselves, but let's do it in a way that doesn't attract a lot of attention. And so we have to remember, just like Jesus, the crucifixion of Jesus was not really a lawful thing. And so the council was very much acting illegally, if you will. So thank you for those questions and thoughts. I'm going to look real quick and see this slide, and then we'll be finished. Christianity versus Judaism. So the Jewish leaders were very much the scribes and Pharisees. They were very much entrenched in the Old Testament law. They lived their life based on laws. Now, when you and I think about the Old Testament law, we think about the Ten Commandments, right? But we also know that the Jews had gone beyond that, and they had created hundreds of laws. Some very important, some focused on the minutia. But nonetheless, they were very law-driven. And so Stephen disagreed with this. In his oration and his defense, he talked about the fact that Jewish laws were a temporary thing, that God intended for our focus to be on the coming of the Messiah. And Paul, in Galatians chapter 3, he makes the point of the difference between the law and the promise. In Galatians 3, verse 19, Paul says, addressing the law, "Why then was the law given at all? It was added because of the transgressions until the seed to whom the promise referred had come," the seed being Jesus. In verse 23 of Galatians 3,